So this brings us to the last part of our course, which is seeking comfort and meaning through suffering. Well, the problem of evil is a philosophical question of an incalculable depth, arising from the very center of life's most trying experiences. Now, instead, it becomes a guiding light that brings comfort and points the way to a more meaningful life for those who are struggling in the shadows of tragedy. Now, by looking into the origins of evil, we validate the full range of the human emotion and experience. See, theodicy accepts suffering as a shared human experience rather than denying it, and knowing that you are not alone in the struggles and that dealing with pain is a universal human experience and can be a great source of solace. So when you think about why bad things happen to good people, we develop empathy and compassion. And so when going through tough times, this bond of empathy can be relied on the support of those around us. In the midst of despair, knowing that others have overcome adversities with fortitude and dignity can light the way. So investigating the origins of evil forces us to ask the age-old question, why is there suffering in the world? By asking questions, we take the first step on the path towards understanding by looking inward and enlarging our philosophical contemplation. We may come to an understanding that suffering, when met with bravery and faith, can be a source of these positive outcomes. So the Christian story of Christ's suffering, which is the ultimate redemption, is shed new light by an apologetic Christian lens. So God's solidarity with human suffering is best illustrated by the incarnation of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. So this story not only demonstrates how to bear adversity with grace, but also guarantees us growth and renewal are possible in the wake of tragedy. So the study of theodicy necessitates an intensive investigation into the divine. And this method has the potential to deepen one's comprehension of God's attributes like power, knowledge, and love. The realization that there is a divine plan beyond human comprehension can be a source of comfort and strength for believers in face of adversity, weaved in with the threads of joy and triumph and fortitude is the thread of suffering. And the study of evil provides a roadmap for marking one's way through the complex architecture, leading one to peace and significance. And it is a reminder that hardship can be transformed into a chance for greater self-awareness, empathy, and self-development. See, apologetics not only accepts the reality of pain, but also gives us a model for welcoming it with serenity and gratitude. See, faith and reason harmonize in a pursuit of knowledge, illuminating a way out of the hopelessness, out of the obscurity, and into a beauty that is all the more radiant for having been forged in the fires of adversity. So when we go through this, we know we're not alone, that God is with us, that He has never left us nor forsaken us. And the most beautiful part about it is His name, Emmanuel, meaning God with us. Let's now look into the responses from Christians. Well, Christians have been given their response in 2,000 years, and they center around two ideas, theodicy and the inscrutability. Theoretically, God's permissiveness of evil can be explained by the principle inherent to His nature, His plan for the world. And this method presents a variety of theodicies, each of which provides a unique explanation for the existence and the purpose of suffering. Now, whether it be the attainment of greater goods, the formation of character, or the manifestation of divine justice and mercy. Another option is the path of inscrutability, well, which recognizes that God's intentions are too complex for human understanding. It argues that we cannot fathom God's providence in its entirety because of our human limitations, and that just because we can't understand it, why God allows suffering, doesn't mean he doesn't have good reasons to do so. So then the question remains to all of us is, well, what would be the biblical perspective to this? Well, several theodicies have biblical support and provide insight into this evil problem. Well, looking at suffering according to the punishment theodicy, is that God's just punishment for evil doing. Suffering according to the soul building theodicy transforms people's personalities, shifting their focus from themselves to God. A theodicy known as pain as God's loud hailer posits that suffering draws a non-believer's attention to God and afterlife, and while and where they may have a conversion sort of heart and experience coming to him. So those who subscribe to a greater good theodicy believe that evil exists but is ultimately justified because it leads to greater good. Now this overarching sort of theodicy emphasizes how virtues like bravery, compassion and forgiveness emerge in a response to adversity. Now concerning the message of the Bible, it's crucial that we ask if the Bible backs up the idea God orchestrates greater good through the presence of, call it, suffering and trials, as we wrestle with this problem of evil. And the theodicy in response to it, the answer to the question requires some serious exegetical digging into the passages that shed light on God's motivation and the intrinsic relationship between human suffering and his higher plans. So a deeper comprehension of God, his dealings with humanity, and the complex web of existence are up for grabs in this ongoing conversation. So in exploring the nature of evil, we not only confront philosophical mysteries, but also create opportunities for personal development and a closer relationship with the mysteries of the divine. Who is this God? Well, addressing the questions of suffering and evil requires a firm foundation in the biblical understanding of God's attributes. Well, this comprehension serves as a defense mechanism against being misguided by false beliefs and as a basis for theoretical reflection. You see, a thorough understanding of God's true nature protects us from falling into the same traps of misinterpretation, doubt, and just as the serpent set for Eve by distorting her perception of God's attributes. See, attributes like love, sovereignty, wisdom, and goodness are all woven together into forming a picture of God's character in the Bible. This enlightenment can be used as a beacon in the darkest hour of suffering and trials. The Bible reassures us that God's omnipotence does not mean that he causes evil, but that he can redeem even the worst of circumstances. Even our knowledge is limited. His wisdom assures us that he sees the big picture. So a firm understanding of God's attributes provides emotional sustenance in times when theoretical discourse seems insufficient. It is a sobering reminder that God cares deeply about the anguish of our world and stays close to those who are hurting. So, despite the existence of evil, the goodness remains unflinching. This realization provides comfort, trust, and hope, allowing us to face adversity in the light of God, who is unchanging and good. And in the end, knowing that God, as he is portrayed in the scripture, gives believers the ability to tell the truth from lies. Even when confronted with the mystery of suffering, it fortifies us with the knowledge of who God really is, a guiding light in the midst of the darkness of doubt and despair, allowing us to face adversity with intellectual clarity and emotional assurance. You see, this issue of light versus darkness, God versus evil. Well, this concept of good and evil as two separate and equal forces locked in an internal conflict is central to dualism, a school of theology. This idea splits the universe into two opposing forces which challenge the traditional monotheistic view of God's absolute sovereignty. So because it goes against fundamental Christian beliefs, dualism is a heresy in the Christian context. A heresy of dualism can be explained as follows. You see, the biblical depiction of God's sovereignty in monotheism is directly challenged by the doctrine of dualism. It implies that there is a dark force as potent as God himself, and that this force exists. The central tenet of monotheism is that God is one and only transcendent over all else and utterly powerful. Psalm 135 verse 6 states, "Wherever the Lord pleases, or whatever the Lord pleases, he does in heaven and on earth, and in the seas and all the deeps. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his own will, the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can say stay out of his hand and say to him, what have you done?" And we see this in Daniel chapter 4 verse 35 as well. See, God's goodness is called into question when dualism depicts an eternal struggle between two opposing forces. If there is an equally potent evil force, it means that God is not all powerful and cannot wipe out all evil altogether. So this runs counter to the Bible's portrayal of God as the ultimate source of good and love. You see, the heresy of dualism can be diminished, the importance of Christ's atoning sacrifice. The idea that Christ's sacrifice on the cross is sufficient to vanquish evil is called into question if evil is equally potent force. So this perspective undermines the redemptive potential of Christ's atonement. Dualism can cause a person's faith to be misplaced by turning attention away from God and towards evil, as many do. Now, if it is possible that the eternal conflict between the forces of good and evil could overshadow the importance of the acknowledging the God as the ultimate source of authority, love, and redemption, the result can be a warped view of who God is and how we relate to him. So God alone, he says in Isaiah chapter 46 verses 9 to 10, "I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things not done, saying my counsel shall stand and I accomplish all my purpose." See, dualism can lead to a deduction in the value placed on individual responsibility and culpability. If evil is just as potent as good, then maybe our free will does not matter all that much in the great grand scheme of things that runs counter to the teachings of the Bible, which stress the importance of personal accountability, free will, and the results of our actions. So by positing the eternal struggle between two equally potent forces, good and evil, dualism as a theological concept challenges the central tenets of Christianity. This runs counter to the monotheistic understanding of God's omnipotence, benevolence, and atoning sacrifice in Christ. You see, the central message of God's love, sovereignty, and salvation is diminished by the heresy of dualism, which distorts the core teachings of Christianity. Well, God's sovereignty, it is not some theoretical concept. Rather, it reveals itself as evidence for his intentionality. See, because of this, God is not portrayed as a sort of passive bystander, but rather as an active conductor of his own creation. Instead of nullifying individual agency, his omnipotent rule resonates beautifully with the decisions we make and incorporates them into his grand scheme. So God's sovereignty beats with the meaning across the entire spectrum of creation in every human heart. It reaches its pinnacle in the redemptive story, a symphony in God's turns the tumult, the pain of human history into a beautiful melody that displays his benevolence and wisdom. Now, we'll be looking into the many facets of God's absolute rule, in going forward. And its salvation significance is complex history, its function and profound personal implications, in which we will see being revealed. And we will grow in the knowledge and confidence in God, who rules supremely over all and explore all terrains of absolute domination. The Christian faith, a holistic view. Well, Christians have always sought to understand God's plan and plan for their lives. And so as the outline of God's power and authority are revealed, it becomes crucial to embrace God's sovereignty. How can a good God allow suffering? And other such questions reverberate in our hearts. And this basically is a question of how does his providence coexist with free will? And we can make sense of the big picture by viewing it through the lens of the absolute sovereignty. It includes his love and justice and mercy, and it is the foundation upon which Christianity theology is built on. So when dealing with the uncertainty and the adversity, the path we take through life is fraught with obstacles and peril. Knowing that God is ultimately in control, he is like having a lighthouse during these stormy times. It is a rock-solid reminder that God is not just a bystander to our lives, but rather the conductor, knowing that even in the darkest valleys, providence and which prevails brings forth to those who acknowledge him, his sovereignty in the face of chaos and adversity. So the contemplation of God's omnipotence inspires awe, reverence, and humility. So as a result, we are forced to acknowledge our own smallness in the face of an infinite wisdom and power of the universe creator. So when we realize that God's ways are beyond our comprehension, we are humbled and are able to worship more fully. Recognizing his absolute power helps us appreciate the grace of giving up control and increases our faith in his direction and providence. So, revealing of this core ideas, by accepting the doctrine of God's sovereignty, we are able to get to the core ideas that form the basis of our theology. It reveals God's omnipotence over the universe, his dynamic role in human history, and his personal involvement in each of our individual destinies. Now, this realization compels us to look into the far-reaching implications it has, and how has the sovereignty coincides with his love, how his plans outplay out in the fabric of human existence, and how our faith intertwines in with his divine purpose. So the doctrine of God's sovereignty is like a beautiful symphony melody, fitting in the perfect with all of the truths and revelations that make up the grand symphony of faith. Its significance goes beyond the simple intellectual understanding. It becomes a safety net in times of trouble, a reason for awe and call to explore God's nature in the greater detail. So when we accept his teachings, we not only find the resolution to our theological questions, but also a permanent link to the very center of God. So God's sovereignty and the problem of evil, when exploring the biblical evidence of God's sovereignty, it sheds light on the knotty connections between this doctrine and the mystery of evil. So as we dig deeper into the Bible, we find insights that show how God's sovereignty relates to the problem of evil. So the account of creation in Genesis chapter 1 provides an early glimpse into God's sovereignty as creator. The fact that he can create everything simply by speaking it into existence is a demonstration of his absolute power and authority. This basically does not deal with the issue of evil head on, but does outlay some groundwork by establishing God's authority as creator and his supremacy over everything. God's omnipotence is on display, full display throughout the Old Testament. His ability to control time, nature, and achieve his ends is demonstrated by the accounts of the flood and the Exodus. The complexity of the problem of evil is made clearer when we consider that God's sovereignty permits both the existence of evil and his divine intervention in the midst of it. The problem of evil and suffering rises from the issues of the question on how God's sovereignty over the universe interacts with these realities. So, divine plan of God and his providence. Well, God's sovereign plan, which includes human history and individual lives, is gradually revealed throughout the biblical narrative. God's handiwork is on display in both Joseph's rise from slavery to leadership and Cyrus the Great's role in restoring Israel. The issue of evil is given in the divine perspective in this context. So the essence of this connection is summarized in Romans chapter 8 verse 28. God's sovereignty does not do away with suffering, but rather incorporates it into a larger divine plan that ultimately benefits those who he loves. So God's omnipotence and his existence of the evil present a tension worthy of thought. And the existence of evil does not invalidate God's sovereignty, rather it demonstrates the extent to which he rules the universe. So the Bible's teaching of God's sovereignty gives us a comfort in the face of incomprehensibility of the evil's origin and its persistence. So while troubling, the problem of evil is not isolated from the story of God's redemptive plan, which includes restoration, the ultimate victory of good over evil. You see, so we come to the next part, which is God's sovereignty and its bearing on theodicy. The concept of God's absolute authority is at the center, at the heart of any discussion about theodicy, the study on how a good God can tolerate evil. Psalms 115 verse 3, our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. And this psalm affirms that God's absolute dominion over all creation, that evil exists at all, is a further proof of his absolute rule over all of creation. Recognizing his supreme power compels us to put our faith in him, even in the face of unfathomable tragedy. So the concept of divine omnipotence is central to the theodicy debate, which seeks to explain why good God would permit evil. And the knowledge that God's omnipotence is not limited by the existence of evil is founded in the realm of God's omnipotence, assuring us further, Lord God, Jeremiah 32 verse 17, you with your mighty power and your extended hand created the heavens and the earth. Nothing is out of your reach because of his unlimited power. We know that evil will eventually submit to God, to him. So foreknowledge and predestination presents difficult theological questions. There may be a conflict between the idea of God has predetermined certain events and the idea of human free will or freedom. So we do, however, catch a glimpse of the purpose, the tapestry within the realm of God's sovereignty. To shed light on this concept, in Romans chapter 8 verse 29 states, for those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of the Son, in order that he might be firstborn among many brothers. So his foreknowledge, or the knowledge of suffering, does not diminish the power. Rather, it reveals a redemptive and beneficial plan that can be derived even from the most excruciating circumstances. So the concept of divine omnipotence is central to the theodicy debate, which seeks to explain why good God would permit evil. Now, the knowledge of God's omnipotence, not limited by the existence of evil, is found in the realm of God's omnipotence. Assuring us further is our Lord God, Jeremiah 32 verse 17, you with your mighty power and extended arm created the heavens and the earth. Nothing is out of your reach because of his unlimited power. And we know that evil will eventually submit to him. So foreknowledge and predestination present a difficult theological question. There may be a conflict between the idea of God has predetermined certain events and the idea of human free will or freedom. So we do, however, catch a glimpse of the purpose and the tapestry within the realm of God's sovereignty. To shed light on this concept, Romans chapter 8 verse 29 states, "For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among all brothers." So his knowledge of suffering does not diminish because of his power. Rather, it reveals a redemptive and beneficial plan that can be derived even from the most excruciating of circumstances. Let's now look into God's sovereignty and human affairs. Well, the doctrines of election and predestination are often discussed in the context of theodicy. Now, the study of how evil could coexist with God's absolute rule over the universe, his omnipotence, provides the foundation for the doctrine of election and predestination, which explores God's role in deciding who will be saved. Well, this truth is echoed throughout Ephesians chapter 1 verses 4 to 5. So even as he chose us in him before the foundations of the world, that we may be holy and blameless before him, according to his good pleasure of his will. So God the Father has adopted us as his sons through Jesus Christ. And here God's sovereignty is revealed as the driving force behind each person's ultimate destinies, destroying the power over evil in the process. So grace and faith play a pivotal part because they highlight the interplay between God's sovereignty and human action amidst the complexity of theodicy. So through evil's existence, it raises questions of salvation, demonstrating that God's gracious sovereignty is there, and for it is by grace that you've been saved through faith. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 8. So no one can take credit for this. It is a gift of God, not earned through good behavior. So within this framework, salvation is initiated by God's grace and is carried out in accordance with his sovereign plan through the agency of human faith. So the reality that evil can do nothing to challenge God's sovereignty emerges at the intersection of the question raised by theodicy and the truths that reveal by salvation. See, theodicy's question and salvation answers meet at the intersection of God's sovereignty. His omnipotence is reflected in the doctrine of election and predestination. His intricate design is full on display in the interplay between God's grace and human faith. So we learned a profound, somewhat truth, somewhere between the theodicy question and the salvation answers. Evil is helpless in the face of God's omnipotence. So God's sovereignty in history and nations. God uses the nations and governments. Well, the focus of theodicy moves from human free will to God's sovereign control of history and international affairs. The doctrine of God's sovereignty is brilliantly demonstrated by the fact that he uses empires and leaders to accomplish his divine purposes, even when they reject his authority. Well, this truth is echoed throughout the scriptures, most notably in Daniel chapter 2 verse 21. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. This reveals God's sovereignty is not limited by what humans can see. Rather, God uses the rise and fall of nations to accomplish his purposes. So despite the challenge presented by theodicy, a fundamental truth becomes clear in the rise and fall of nations are in harmony with God's grand design. So his absolute control over the world does not waver when chaos and confusion reign. He always directs history towards his purposes. It is written in Proverbs chapter 21 verse 1 that the king's heart is in a stream of water in the hand of the Lord, and he turns it wherever he will. This demonstrates that God's sovereignty is not molded by evil or influenced by the world around him. Rather, his divine plan continues to operate unabatedly, unseen by human eyes. So the grand story of humanity is woven into the tapestry of God's sovereignty. And while theodicy raises concerns about how God could allow evil to exist, the doctrine of God's sovereignty demonstrates his omnipotence role in shaping history. So while realizing it, empires and their leaders become instruments of his design. And the coincidence of the events of God's plan is a reminder of the immensity of his plan. So which is beyond our ability to fathom, and is revealed a glimpse of the divine orchestration that is unaffected by evil. So God's sovereignty in personal lives, well, guidance and providence. Looking deeper into the realm of theodicy, we find that God's sovereignty is not limited to a grand tapestry of history and nations, but rather extends deeply into the personal lives of individuals. So our lives are shaped by his providential care and guiding hand. So according to Proverbs chapter 16 verse 9, the heart of man plans his ways, but the Lord establishes his steps. See, this reveals that God's personal involvement, as even the most complex choices, fits into his overarching design. So, in the midst of the mystery of theodicy, questions about God's sovereignty arises around the topic of suffering. However, his sovereignty is not diminished even in the midst of adversity. He has the ability to transform us through adversity and draw us closer to him in the process of this all. So when it seems like nothing is going right, remember Romans chapter 8 verse 28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his what? Purpose. Here, hardship serves as a blank slate for God to create a masterpiece of redemption and development in the lives of the children. Now, our individual stories all have a place in the grand panorama of God's omnipotence. God's sovereignty sheds light on the dark places of our lives as theodicy explores the nuances of God's role in the presence of evil. So it is the rule that guides and weaves and the purposes even through the web, in an entangled web of pain. The same divine hand that directs the course of history also guides us and gives us purpose in the midst of difficulties. So when we submit to his authority, we gain security, meaning, and harmony with a plan that is both cosmic and very personal to you and I. So a biblical worldview emerges as a response to the conflict. God's omnipotence and human agency sing together in a perfect harmony throughout the Bible. Humans are given a tremendous gift and capacity to free will, which include the ability to make decisions, take initiative, and accept responsibility, even as God's providential hand conducts the orchestra of the existence. So there is an sort of intricate dance between God's sovereignty and the human agency. Each choice and deed becomes a living testimony to this. So the challenge of human accountability and responsibility is at the crossroads as theodicy investigates the complex questions of how a good God interacts with a world marred by evil. And yet, even in the midst of this paradox, the answer rings with a beautiful harmony. God's sovereignty and human agency coexist, each adding to its own unique note to the symphony of existence. Now, these truths interweave like a thread of tapestry to form a more complex picture of God's relationship with humanity, the complexities of theodicy, just as the threads of a tapestry do. So along the way of the Odyssey, one encounters the inexplicable presence of evil and suffering in a world ruled by all-powerful and benevolent God, which poses as a formidable challenge. So believers and theologians alike are faced with the question, how can God of sovereignty and love permit evil of suffering? Well, this challenge is called the Odyssey. Now, in the light of this, the field of the Odyssey takes on the role of a laboratory for theological investigation. The question of suffering goes far beyond the question of curiosity, developing into a profound quest for insight and peace. Emerging theological perspectives attempt to make sense of the entangled relationship between God's omnipotence, human agency, and the mystery of evil. So these viewpoints negotiate and the fine line of the Odyssey, illuminating the redemptive undercurrents of God's divine plan, while recognizing is the mysterious contours. So the conflict between God's sovereignty, the reality of suffering, is the central thread in the tapestry of the Odyssey. It encourages those interested in religion to delve into philosophical discussions about the nature of God and the meaning of suffering in this world. Now, in this context of the Odyssey is revealed not only as a difficulty but also as an opportunity to call and explore the enigma and the paradox in order to better understand the deep contours of a God whose sovereignty is intertwined with the redemptive purpose that extends beyond the depths of human suffering. So this is a constant tension between God's absolute rule and the realm of human freedom that emerges in the winding of the alleyways of theology discourse. Now, this conundrum is echoed by the question of whether or not God's sovereignty over the universe can coexist with free will. Now, in response to this rich tapestry of theological viewpoints, has emerged all of which seek to balance God's omnipotence with the rhythms of human autonomy. The mysteries of dynamics that plays here give rise to the concept of compatibilism, which advocates for a meaning or a meeting of the points between God's absolute sovereignty and free will of an individual human. Now, in this view, God's omnipotence plays the role of a symphony conductor steering the events while letting free-willed humans play their part. So the conflict between God's omnipotence and the human autonomy begs us to ask weighty questions. As we look further into theological territory, where does God's absolute control meet the nuanced terrain of free will? How compatible are the liberty and authority here? We find a landscape ripe with introspection and a place where one can explore the depths of theological paradoxes and come away with a more nuanced picture of the complex interplay between God's omnipotence and the rich tapestry of human freedom. So as we journey through the theological landscape, we encountered a theme that resonates with the surrender, a surrender born from the understanding of God's sovereign plan. The tapestry of God's sovereignty invites us to relinquish our grasp on the reins of control and surrender to Him His masterful guidance, control over our lives. And in this surrender, we acknowledge that His ways transcend our limited understanding and surpasses our human wisdom. And just as in the ancient words of the Proverbs, reminds us, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. Now we learn to place our trust in the one who orchestrates every thread of our existence. Surrender within the context of God's sovereignty. Become an act of humility and wisdom, a yielding of our ambitions and desires to the one who weaves a grand tapestry of purpose. So it is an acknowledgement that His design far surpasses our own. Our surrender finds its anchor in the assurance that His plan is perfect and purposeful. Thus, the theological implication beckons us to surrender and to trust in God's plan, allowing His sovereign wisdom to guide our steps and shape our journey. So when the tempests of turmoil threaten to engulf us, the doctrine of God's sovereignty stands as an unwavering lighthouse in the midst of uncertainty. We find comfort in the unchanging truth that God remains in control. His sovereignty is the bedrock on which we stand. And as we let go of anxiety and trust our circumstances into His capable hands, the Apostle Paul's words become a lifeline. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your heart and your mind in Christ Jesus. Philippians chapter 4, verse 6 and 7. So this peace born from trust in His sovereignty becomes the anchor for which your soul during life's storms take comfort and peace.